20 years ago, China was the definition of economic momentum. It delivered a stretch of growth so fast, and on such a massive base, that it became the benchmark for modern development. But the trajectory today looks very different. The IMF expects China's growth to sit around the high 4% range in 2025 and soften further in 2026. And their bigger warning is this: without meaningful reforms, China's long-run growth potential could drift toward the low single digits by the 2030s, far below what powered the last decade, and likely not enough to reliably close the gap with the United States. At the same time, China's global position has become more complicated. On one hand, many advanced economies are openly trying to reduce their dependence on Chinese manufacturing, sometimes loudly through policy, sometimes quietly through incentives and procurement changes. On the other hand, China's trade surplus has climbed to record levels, becoming the first economy to post net exports above $1 trillion in a single year. In other words, it's not that the world suddenly doesn't want Chinese goods. Often it's that supply chains still don't have a clean substitute at scale, that tension creates a real opening. If the world is searching for alternatives and China's domestic growth is cooling, then the next phase of global production is up for grabs in a way we haven't seen in decades. That's why we're now watching a new race form. Vietnam, Mexico, Indonesia, lots of countries are positioning themselves to absorb the spillover from shifting supply chains. But one candidate is drawing the most attention. For the first time in a generation, India is sitting near the center of the world's most important industrial reshuffle. India set an ambitious target of becoming a $5 trillion economy by 2025, which, standing here at the end of the year, looks optimistic on timing. But even if that headline number slips, the broader direction is hard to ignore. India is already the world's fifth largest economy, and while growth is cooling in many other large economies, the IMF expects India to grow in the mid-6% range through 2025 and 2026. And the corporate moves are starting to match the narrative. Apple is expanding iPhone assembly in India. LG is building a manufacturing hub with capacity in the millions of appliances each year. Toyota, Honda, and Suzuki are investing heavily to expand vehicle production. Across industries, the same question keeps coming up in boardrooms and ministries. Can India become the next factory at scale, the way China was for the last 20 years? To answer that, we need to work through three things. First, what's actually behind China's slowdown? What changed in the engine of its growth? Second, can India avoid the same pressure points as it scales? And third, is the next cheapest location even a durable strategy in a world that now cares more about resilience, geopolitics, and speed? For roughly 2 decades, the global manufacturing formula was straightforward. Cheap labor, plus open trade, plus a world eager for affordable goods equals a once-in-a-generation opportunity to become the planet's factory. China didn't just participate in that system, it mastered it. Entire supply chains moved east, and cities like Shenzhen and Guangzhou transformed at extraordinary speed, scaling from relatively modest urban centers into global production powerhouses, making everything from electronics to everyday household goods. For a long time, China's numbers made that dominance feel inevitable. Between 2000 and 2010, China averaged around 10% GDP growth per year, an exceptional performance for an economy of that size. Over the broader period, since the late 1970s, that rise helped lift hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, reshaping living standards in a way very few countries have achieved. But lately, the pattern is shifting. Growth has slowed into the approximately 5% range, which is still strong for a large economy, but it's a real step down from the era of rapid catch-up. And the reasons are less about one single shock and more about the underlying conditions changing. Start with labor. In the early 2000s, the average factory wage in China was low enough that outsourcing to China was often the obvious choice. Today, wages have risen meaningfully. That's a positive story for household incomes and domestic demand, but it also compresses the advantage that made low-end, low-margin manufacturing so easy to move offshore. As wages go up, companies face a choice: pay more, automate more, or relocate production to a cheaper base. Then there's demographics. China's workforce is aging, and the working age population peaked years ago. Fewer new workers are entering factories, and more retirees need support, either through families or the state. This doesn't end manufacturing, but it does change the economics of labor-intensive production at scale. To keep growth strong as labor costs climbed, China leaned heavily on another engine: property. Local governments sold land, developers borrowed aggressively, and households placed huge amounts of savings into apartments that were expected to hold value and often appreciate. That cycle supported everything around it: construction demand, steel and cement output, home appliances, furniture, an entire ecosystem of domestic activity. But once confidence in that cycle weakened, the downside became clear. Large developers struggled, Home sales cooled, local government revenues took a hit, and projects stalled. A sector that had been pulling growth higher started weighing it down, especially as unfinished projects and weaker sentiment spread through the broader economy. And while these domestic shifts were happening, the external environment changed too. Globalization, the exact system that accelerated China's rise, is no longer expanding the way it did in the 1990s and 2000s. The US has tightened restrictions around advanced semiconductors and key equipment. Europe has introduced new trade barriers in areas like electric vehicles, citing concerns about subsidies and competition. And even companies that still depend on China are building redundancy. That strategy is often described as China plus one. Keep a footprint in China, but develop a second production base elsewhere to reduce single-country risk. Apple is a clean example. China remains central, but India and Vietnam are increasingly important in the plan. Technology adds another layer. Advanced automation has become more capable and more affordable. Work that once required large teams can now be done with far fewer people, which means the cheapest labor advantage matters less than it used to. For many firms, proximity to customers, reliability of shipping, and political stability now rank higher than sheer headcount. If you can make the same product in multiple places, you're more likely to choose the location with fewer disruptions and clearer policy risk, even if it isn't the absolute lowest cost option. Put all of that together and you get a simple conclusion. China's economy is still huge and innovative, but the specific model that delivered the export-driven miracle of the 1990s and 2000s is no longer operating under the same conditions. The game itself has changed. And that's what makes India's timing so interesting, because even if India tried to copy China's playbook step for step, it would be doing it in a world where the original rules no longer apply. Historically, India's strongest export advantage was services, software, accounting, design, compliance, back-office operations, the work that helps global companies run. That built a different kind of workforce, a large base of English-speaking talent, problem-solving at scale, and a private sector used to navigating constraints. Now India is pushing hard on something it didn't fully capture in the first wave of globalization: large-scale manufacturing. A major lever here is a set of production-linked incentive, PLI, programs, basically targeted incentives that reward companies not just for building factories, but for producing and shipping from India in specific strategic sectors. The idea is simple. The more you manufacture locally, electronics, auto components, even parts of the semiconductor chain, the more support you unlock. And you can already see early traction. Foxconn is expanding iPhone-related production capacity. Samsung runs one of the world's largest phone factories near Delhi. Micron is investing in chip packaging and testing, often a first step toward a deeper semiconductor ecosystem. These moves matter because manufacturing isn't just one factory, it's a network. Suppliers cluster, skills build, technicians learn what production at scale actually requires, and over time, the ecosystem becomes easier for the next company to join. But India may have an additional advantage that didn't exist in the same way during China's early surge: digital infrastructure. Over the past decade, India built a remarkably integrated stack: digital ID, instant payments, and data sharing rails that make it easier for individuals and small businesses to operate formally. That can reduce friction. Shop owners can establish records that help them access credit, suppliers can get paid instantly, and government payments can be delivered directly with fewer intermediaries and delays. So the setup is real. China's old engine is cooling, global supply chains are rebalancing, and India is building the tools to compete. But the real question isn't whether India can attract manufacturing. It already is. The deeper question is whether India can scale in a world that prioritizes resilience, geopolitics, and technology, and whether it can do it without repeating the same bottlenecks that are now slowing China. Put simply, India has made meaningful progress in cutting back the kind of bureaucracy that used to scare off investment, so much so that it was once a story worth a standalone deep dive. It's not fixed, and anyone doing business on the ground will tell you there's still friction, delays, and inconsistent execution. But reducing that friction matters, because India doesn't have to become the easiest place on earth to build a factory. It just has to become easier than the alternatives, easier than China at the margin, and easier than other developing peers competing for the same projects. What's helping India here is that its strategy isn't coming from a single control tower. China benefited from intense competition between provinces, but the overall direction was still strongly shaped from the top. India does have national programs, things like production-linked incentives and Make in India, but much of the momentum is actually happening at the state level. States are competing aggressively for investment, speeding up permits, improving grid reliability, offering training pipelines, and building industrial parks designed around specific sectors. Some states are leaning hard into electronics. Others are making a play for autos, textiles, or appliances. And when different regions specialize, local supplier networks start to form naturally, often faster than a one-size-fits-all national plan. The outcome is not clean or uniform. It's uneven, sometimes chaotic, and different states are moving at very different speeds. But it's also real. You can see clusters forming, supply chains thickening, and capabilities building, one project at a time. That said, the gap India needs to close is still large. Manufacturing is only around the low teens share of India's GDP, well below the level China reached at its industrial peak. And practical constraints still impose real costs. Power reliability can be inconsistent in key regions. Roads can bottleneck shipments. Port logistics can be slower than global companies are used to. Land acquisition and permitting can still be complicated, and businesses frequently mention unpredictable local rules, especially when regulations vary sharply from district to district. Then there's a bigger structural issue: inclusion. India's growth has disproportionately rewarded skilled urban workers, while large parts of the rural population haven't felt the same upward pull. A cutting-edge chip facility might employ a few thousand high-skilled workers, but it doesn't automatically generate the kind of mass employment needed for millions of new entrants to the labor market every year. That's why many economists argue India needs balance. Pair big high-tech wins with labor-intensive, scalable industries. Appliances, consumer electronics, components, affordable vehicles, areas that can absorb far more workers at different skill levels. If that balance doesn't happen, India risks a two-speed economy, world-class tech corridors for a relatively small segment, and slow productivity growth for everyone else. That's not a uniquely Indian risk. You can see versions of it around the world, but it becomes more pronounced in a country where broad-based human development still has room to improve. If most households don't see rising incomes, domestic demand stays muted. Labor remains trapped in low productivity work. Inequality can widen. And even putting social costs aside, it becomes harder to maximize national output. If India can't fully mobilize its workforce, matching China's scale, let alone competing head-to-head, gets much tougher. Still, India has one advantage that's easy to underestimate: capability depth. Modern manufacturing isn't just about cheap wages anymore. Global companies need technicians who can keep automated lines running at odd hours. They need quality teams that can trace defects across a complex supplier chain. They need managers who can pass international audits and compliance checks consistently, not just once. This is where India's services legacy helps. For decades, India trained large numbers of people to work with data, processes, documentation, and global clients across time zones. That operational muscle can translate well into complex industrial systems, especially as factories become more automated and process-heavy. And the timing matters. If India wants to capture a lasting position in the next supply chain era, this window won't stay open forever. Tariffs, geopolitics, and risk management have created demand for diversification, but companies are already signing long-term contracts, buying land, and building plants. Once a major factory opens, suppliers tend to follow quickly: glass, batteries, camera modules, packaging, logistics providers. Nearby universities adjust curricula. Training institutes expand. Payments and documentation move faster through digital systems like UPI, and paperwork that used to take days can shift online. India isn't perfect, and progress isn't evenly distributed, but the foundations are becoming visible. If India can keep pairing digital infrastructure with practical industrial capacity, ports, power, skills, and supplier depth, it might not only take a larger share of manufacturing, it could also shape what the next model looks like. And that's the key point. India isn't copying China's playbook line for line. It's not trying to win purely by being the cheapest place to make everything. It's trying to become a place where companies can build, scale, certify, export, and expand with fewer surprises, especially in a world where resilience matters as much as cost. But that strategy depends on companies continuing to hedge, building production across multiple markets to reduce single-country risk, and keep supply chains moving when shocks hit. So far, that's exactly what's happening. Look at the map and you can see the competition forming in real time. Vietnam has been a major beneficiary of electronics relocation, drawing huge investments near Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City, and expanding exports rapidly, especially to the US. Mexico's strength is geography. Factories can reach the US market in hours, not weeks, which becomes a major edge when delays can disrupt entire industries. And Mexico's momentum is real, but constraints like security risks, policy uncertainty in energy, and infrastructure bottlenecks can limit how far nearshoring scales. Indonesia brings another kind of appeal: natural resources, and a strategy to build clean tech and EV-related value chains around those inputs. But it also faces familiar hurdles: port congestion, bureaucracy, and gaps in specialized training that can slow industrial scaling. This is where India's case looks different. It isn't only offering lower wages or good positioning. It's offering scale, relative stability, and, crucially, a domestic market large enough to consume a meaningful share of what it produces. For multinationals, that combination is powerful: export potential plus internal demand, which few alternatives can match at the same scale. Geopolitics also gives India flexibility. It's not tightly aligned with one bloc in a way that forces a single set of trade relationships. It can do business across lines, buy commodities from one partner, technology from another, defense systems from another, while still attracting major investment from global firms. In a fragmented world, that multi-alignment can be a practical advantage. Of course, none of this means China will quietly step aside. People have predicted an imminent China collapse for decades, and China still has major strengths: industrial depth, infrastructure, supply chain density, and massive export capability. So the real story isn't that China disappears, it's that the global system is making room for additional hubs, and India is positioning itself to become one of the most important. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being here. If you like the video, please subscribe for more. Feel free to leave a comment with your questions or ideas.